Hello, this is Paul Chek, and the title of my video blog today is Exploring Pornography. This is such a messy topic out there that I had to wear my bib today just to make sure that I didn't get my clothes dirty talking about this one. Actually, this is a very special bib made for me by the Carr family, Donald, Kathy, Josh, and Ryan, which I use to make natural medicines. So my dream is today that we make some natural medicine together on the topic of pornography, which is quite a hot topic. It's a massive, massive money maker. It's a problem in the church. It's a problem for many people in their minds, but it is not a problem when it comes to making money. I can assure you that. In fact, if you look at the book Sex at Dawn, which I have recommended before, I highly recommend to all of you. The audiobook is excellent. They give some pretty shocking statistics about not only how much money is being made off the sale of pornographic videos and related issues or products, but they show you things such as General Motors, which actually owns a film distribution branch, makes more money selling pornography than they do selling cars. Most people wouldn't expect that. But it's an issue that's been shall we say, more of a problem as the Judeo-Christian religious ideals became, shall we say, the cultural norm. Once you get behind that, as I'll show in succeeding blogs, it's not so much of an issue anymore. In fact, if you were to be watching pornography, say in the Greco-Roman era, nobody would be excited by it at all. They might wonder why you were watching it instead of doing it, in fact. This blog is going to be broken into two parts. Today I'm going to cover sex and evolution of species. Then in the next part I will cover sex and cultures over time. And then I will also include faiths of man and stages of the development of consciousness. So I'll show you not only how our orientation towards sexual practices has changed in different cultures throughout time, I will show you how different faiths or religions have different perspectives on these things that can be very radically different, and that we now have research showing how consciousness actually grows and develops through different stages within which we have different states or experiences, and that pretty much all the religions have been studied and found to have a common underlying structure, backbone, or theme that relates to the development of human consciousness. And I will show you as clearly as possible that each person's perspective on pornography or anything that goes against the Bible or any religious idea has everything to do with the stage of development of their consciousness, which also relates to their capacity to think and to learn or to use their brain, interestingly. So today I'm going to start off with just some basic things like what is the definition of pornography. So this is from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. I cut the actual number 2 out because it was almost identical to number 1, so what I have as number 2 here was number 3. Pornography, the depiction of erotic behavior in pictures and writing intended to cause sexual excitement. Sounds pretty normal to me. Number 2, depiction of acts in a sensational manner so as to arouse intense emotional reaction. Now, if you pay close attention, you will find that this concept fits movies that go all the way down into the PG category, or that which is approved for children. And it just is put across with different stages of, shall we say, directness, and sometimes in the movies for children, it might be animals acting things out, but in other words, there's less nudity. It's not as explicit, but in many of the kids' movies I've seen, there's obviously the writers are putting little innuendos and jokes in there for the parents who are sitting there with their kids, so that there's messages going in both directions at once. But really, this concept of pornography is really one of the most heavily used concepts in all forms of marketing. Look in any magazine, look in any television ad, whether it be the sales of drugs or the sales of sports equipment or the sales of miracle foods or performance supplements. Pornography is so heavily woven into marketing strategy today that it's actually quite amazing to me that people get all frustrated and upset about it, because the same people that make all the noise about pornography are the ones that just got home from watching a movie that was full of pornography and made no big fuss of it until they found out that their teenage or 20-year-old son was looking at pornography, or their partner was looking at pornography, maybe in their bedroom or on the web, and they caught them or were searching their directory to see what they'd been looking at, which is childish behavior in itself. So we have, many, shall we say, contorted social views that get involved in pornography, most of them based on no legitimate knowledge or exploration of the subject, nor understanding of the sexual behaviors in nature, the evolution of man, the evolution of culture, or the evolution of religion and consciousness. It's just programmed bias behavior, and that's exactly the stuff that makes for miserable relationships, both at the personal level, the social level, the state and national level, and the world level. So the first thing I want to point out is, if you look at the evolution of species, the human being is something about 1.6 to 1.8% different than our nearest biological ancestors, chimpanzees, bonobos, and right behind them in there is gorillas. If you look at studies of people like Jane Goodall, I believe in one of Jane Goodall's reports, she described seeing a female chimpanzee have 50 separate sexual interactions with males throughout the day. In other words, with different males. So she was very, very sexually busy. The research shows that no bipedal upright animal has a monogamous pair bonding type relationship, that they're all, shall we say, polygamous or polyamorous, whichever term you want to use. In other words, they're moving amongst multiple sexual partners. There is no till death do you part, no rings on fingers. And there is a lot of evidence that this type of sexual bonding is extremely important for enhancing the survivability of the species, and that multiple sperm donors are very, very important. There's plenty of good research showing how the female selects the eggs. There's research showing that some males are not compatible with females, and if a woman's in a monogamous pair bond with someone she's not genetically compatible with, someone who is too much like her, can actually cause repulsion because it will not strengthen the offspring. In other words, if your partner has exactly the same weaknesses as you, weaknesses towards viruses, various illnesses, environmental stressors, then the child actually doesn't gain much from being born from that father-mother pairing. But if mother has certain things that father does not have, and father has certain things that mother does not have, the offspring can actually become much stronger and have a greater level of survivability than either parent alone. So there's good research showing that some women can't get pregnant because their partner's sperm is being rejected because something deep in the cell or the wisdom of the body knows it's not a good fit. And unfortunately, people like that go to in vitro fertilization clinics and do all sorts of things to try to force these types of pregnancies instead of understanding what's really potentially going on. So it's a very deep and complex topic, but if we study nature, we find some interesting things. And so I'll go through some of the concepts that I'd like to explore today as well. So my first point is, if you look at chimps and bonobos, they're highly sexual, particularly bonobos. So if you look at the work of Franz de Waal, excellent stuff on audio that you can get or book, and you see that their sexual behavior is really very, very interestingly what researchers find when they do comprehensive studies of human sexuality. So if you look at things like the Kinsey report, any of these major sexual studies, where they're actually investigating what's actually happening in the bedroom and in the private lives of people, and how does that differ from the social persona being presented even in highly religious people, you find things that are actually completely contradictory to what would be called the standard narrative or the consensus view of sexual reality. In other words, people are living heavily in the closet, and our natural tendencies are only being suppressed and compressed by social dogma and social stigma and expectation. But what's really happening on the inside is something quite different. And as a therapist with 32 years of experience of coaching people, I can tell you that people that live against their sexual desires and do not explore them for whatever reasons of religious programming or parental influence have a much higher likelihood of becoming unhealthy people, being depressed, being on drugs, and not having an enjoyable, fulfilling life. So my first issue here is pair bonding or monogamy is the standard narrative. Anything else is dysfunctional. So what that is implying, and that's well covered in Sex at Dawn. Now, just to be fair, one of the people on my YouTube channel wrote back and said, Paul, you might want to look at Sex at Dusk because it contradicts Sex at Dawn. Now, I will say that I haven't had a chance to thoroughly read this book. I've only just looked through it to see what's in it. This book I've been through twice now, cover to cover, and I will tell you that based on my personal experience and my lifetime of studying biology, physiology, psychology, sexuality, everything to do with nature and human beings so that I can be an effective holistic health practitioner, I don't find a single thing in this book that I have a hard time agreeing with at all. Whenever you make any document that goes against the standard narrative, you are going to get all sorts of people that are going to have all sorts of reasons to refute or different interpretations of research. But what I do with my students is I don't encourage them to believe my word as though it's the word of God like religions do. I encourage them to study what I'm sharing with them and go out and practice it and explore it, and to the degree that it does not work effectively to enhance their lives, to come back and ask me for clarification or to find ways to nourish themselves that are more in line with their needs. So Sex at Dusk is a counterbalancing document for those of you that want to look into what the critique is of Sex at Dawn. So what Sex at Dawn shows, and this is not the only place I've seen this research, is that it's actually a social misunderstanding that nature is monogamous. In other words, birds have one partner for their life, cats, dogs, horses, cows, chickens, turkeys, deer, antelopes, buffaloes, rhinos, everything out there. But when they actually do DNA testing and they have people following the animals and studying them and doing careful observations, they find out that monogamous pair bonding is not nearly as common as they thought, and this goes all the way to birds and everything else. So we have to be careful. If you think of all the things you've been told in your life as actual fact by some expert, and then looked into any one of them, and look not only at the expert's opinion, but at the contradictory opinions by other experts, you will come to conclude very quickly that many people are making snap decisions based on only superficial information, such as the abstracts of studies, without ever looking at study design or the belief systems and backgrounds of the researchers themselves, which good research shows has an influence on scientific outcomes, and I'll allude to that again in a minute. In my life, working in the field of holistic health, orthopedic rehabilitation, psychological growth and development, and natural healing, I can tell you that one of my practices has always been, for many, many years, whenever I pull a research study, to the degree that I think that study is important, I go look up all the references they cite, I read the references, and then I go back to the article again, and I see Now that I've read the reference, how did they use that person's material and in what context? And you often find people, A, misinterpreting the people they're referencing, manipulating the people they're referencing, taking very small statements out of context to support their bias. So my point here is when it comes to pornography or anything that we're talking about here, you can't really trust socially traded opinions, experts on television, because most of them themselves are expressing knowledge that's built on what OSHA would call a paper boat, which is the absolute belief that their teachers were right and that the researchers they're studying are right without actually ever investigating to find out if it's true. But when you work like I do in a clinical practice where you're dealing with people that have challenges, you need to get outcomes, you find quickly it doesn't matter what the research says. If it doesn't work, it simply doesn't work, and you have to find other things that do work. So it leads you, if you're intelligent, to exploring ideas. And what do you find? Oftentimes ideas that were completely contradictory to what you thought was the right way or the best way to do something turn out to be that which works. And you learn over time that there's no such thing as the right thing. There's only the right thing for the right situation, which is evidenced by the fact that it works. My buddy Laird Hamilton says the truth is what works, and I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Okay? So with current science and DNA testing, standard beliefs are false more often than they are true. This was what I referred to earlier. When they start going in DNA testing on animals of all different types of species, they find that the monogamous paradigm isn't really nearly as well supported as people would think it is. Now, science results most always reflect the culture and religious beliefs of the scientists or researchers. Most people live split lives. So I'll get to that in a second. This one here, the scientific results most always reflect the cultural and religious beliefs of the researchers and the scientists. I've recommended this book before. I'm going to recommend it again because most people's opinions about pornography are based on religious ideals, or they're based on whatever kind of research they think is objective and correct, most of which usually, again, just fits their religious paradigm. Science Set Free by Rupert Sheldrake, a well-known and celebrated scientist, does a phenomenal job of exposing to the public that science isn't really much different than religion in many ways, and it has many of the same problems that religion does in it. And science is also very famous for manipulating statistics and outcomes to get a contrived result to sell you things or convince you of things that somebody else wants you to believe. And I can tell you my own experience of that is very true. I love science. I just like to know that the science is legitimate and done for reasons of exploration, not to support somebody's bias. And unfortunately, most scientists are on the payrolls of major corporations, and if they don't get the results that the corporation wants, they either redo the statistics or they get fired, and they just keep going until someone creates a good enough mock-up of the study to create the illusion that they're after. And in fact, I have a friend who's an agent for the FDA who is regularly busting medical doctors for writing bogus research for the FDA to prove that drugs are safe and ethical, yet lo and behold, what do they find? A lot of the research has never been done. It's just written up as though it's been done and put in as real research. And this is going on all over the place. I know university professors who have caught students doing the same thing. But some of this stuff ends up in published journals and you actually believe it. So when it comes to something like pornography, something so close to our sensuality and our sexuality, I'm encouraging you not just to take your parents' beliefs or your church's beliefs or other people's beliefs at face value, because you could easily find yourself diminishing yourself and being in pain with guilt and shame based on somebody else's so-called absolute truths, when in reality you could be burning yourself up, stressing yourself, judging yourself, and diminishing yourself on the inside for doing something that's completely natural. And as I'll show in a second, a lot more common than you think. So my last point was here is that today most people live split lives. Social life is not reflective of private sexual practices. You can look at Kinsey, the documentary called Kinsey, but if you get a hold of the Kinsey report and look at his statistics, and there's other researchers who have gotten very similar results. There's a number of studies available. You could probably find several on the internet. But what you find is that there is a much higher incidence, for example, of females having sex with females and desiring sex with females than ever reported on the surface of it or even thought about by most people if you just talk to them. There's a lot higher rate of people jumping out of so-called monogamous marital relationships and having sex on the side. You probably would be surprised to know that the ones that are the most successful at getting sex on the side are married women who are just coming into their ovulatory cycle. So there's a lot of, shall we say, surface behavior or masking, people having a socially contrived paradigm to fit in to avoid the stress that goes with being in a culture that is largely Judeo-Christian, that is largely living out ideals that only cause people pain. And remember, all this guilt and shame and sinning was highly profitable to the church. If you look into the history of how the church acquired land and how it got money from people, it created rules and regulations and commandments that were almost impossible to follow. And then to get forgiven for your sins, you had to pay the church or give them land, and the worse the so-called sin, the more money or land you had to give them. So this is actually, you know, religion is the most ancient and most successful form of business there is. And don't forget, the Vatican is apparently the most lucrative business, one of the most lucrative, if not the most lucrative business in the world. So we have to kind of be a little bit hip and a little bit more wise, or we can find ourselves really beating ourselves up about these things. So my point here is, when you look into the bedrooms of people, you find something going on that is absolutely congruent with what is shared with sex at dawn, based on my life experience and my own research, and spending a lot of time counseling people who are having serious health problems over their beliefs in sex. In fact, I've had so many Catholics with cancer of the sex organs that it's almost a sort of a running little, I don't want to use the word joke, but it's, we all know, and I know, whenever my assistant Vidya tells me, well, you have another client wanting to see you with cancer of the uterus or cancer of the ovaries or cancer of the testicles, it's a little running joke between her and I. Say, oh, let me guess, they're Catholic, right? And it's almost always true. And as a therapist with 32 years of experience, I've had a lot of time to work with a lot of people from a lot of different religions and faiths, and I can tell you I see more sex-related disease in Catholics who have the harshest, some of the harshest sexual restrictions out there that I've ever seen. So if God really wanted it to be that way, you'd have to ask yourself, then why would God's word and God's sexual practices produce so much disease in God's children? And does that really fit with the concept that God is love? I don't think so. Not unless you're really a confused human being who is paying more attention to what other people say than to what you're actually experiencing, and maybe don't have the knowledge or the skill to upgrade your software, so to speak. So let's finish my first part here with a little look at reality. Number one, orgiastic fantasies and practices are natural and normal. When I say orgiastic, I mean multiple partner play, intimacy, play, sex, having fun. Orgiastic behaviors, they're woven into our history. Now, I've only just skimmed the issue. I could write a whole multiple, chapter book on this and have it be 300 or 400 pages real easily. But I encourage all of you to do your own research so you have your own authentic experience of really committing yourself to looking into it. Do you feel more whole, complete, or fulfilled by orgiastic viewing, i.e. pornography, or practices? If you feel more whole or supported in getting your sex drive up, or more excited, and it somehow enhances your relationship with yourself, your relationship with your partner, gives you a sense of greater connection to yourself, helps you learn to explore and understand your own body and your own mind and your own emotions. As long as your partner's happy and you're happy, I think there's nothing wrong with it. You know, when you look at the things that people have to do to themselves with drugs, surgery, psychotherapy, and living lives of anxiety and depression because they don't explore those things, I'd say you're a lot better off with some organic ghee and your sex toys than you are with Xanax or Zoloft or any of the dangerous things they give people who are suffering from various ailments that are the side effects of repression and torturing yourself. Many people contact me because they think their partner has an addiction to pornography. Usually that's only their own insecurity. Oftentimes it's women reporting to me about men or their children. And what I find most commonly is it's often perceived by partners in a paired relationship that if the other one's looking at or interested in pornography, that somehow it means that they're not beautiful or they're not lovable or they're not good enough or they're not satisfying. But that's a very immature perspective. It's classic Judeo-Christian behavior and even Islamic faith behavior in many ways. All the Abrahamic religions are, you know, very, very hard and twisted on their sexual practices and views when you get right down to, you know, what really happens versus what they're saying is happening. So it just produces the pain I've been talking about. But when you start looking at where all these judgments are coming from, it's almost always an interpretation that there's something wrong with me because my partner's looking at pornography. They don't love me, I'm not beautiful, I'm not sexy, which is very childish and immature. How about maybe they're just excited by it, maybe it's fun, maybe it's entertaining, and the research shows that all of us are excited by the interaction of humans and animals having sex, and in fact women are more excitable than men based on blood flow studies to genital organs and various other types of methods for evaluating, whether it be lie detector tests, brain scans, electroencephalograms, and the list just goes on. So women are much, much more sexually adaptable, much more sexually excitable, but they're also much more likely to not tell other people what they're feeling. That's what the research shows. Men are much more predictable, as women would tell you anyhow. Okay? So when it comes to an addiction, my definition of an addiction, and I've worked with a lot of addicts from a lot of different types, is any repeated behavior that does not produce the results you wanted. So before any of you label somebody else as having an addiction to pornography, you should be wise enough to ask them, is the repeated behavior of observing or participating in pornographic or orgiastic activities giving you the results you want or not? If they are getting the results they want, they do not have an addiction, and maybe it's that person's addiction to labeling things, which is also a disease of our culture and of the ego itself. Finally, which I usually start with, what is your dream? If your sexual practices are enhancing your dream, if they're giving you a greater sense of connection to yourself, a greater sense of connection to your partner or partners, a greater sense of life and love and fulfillment, then my God, that's far better medicine than what the medical system has for you if you don't do it, and almost any other system. So if your sexual practices are supporting you in becoming a more whole, more well-rounded individual, and you're being brave enough to explore your natural instincts and urges instead of letting someone scare you away and telling you that God's going to burn you in hell for masturbating or playing with yourself or buying sex toys or using them with your partners or any of that, I'd say exploring yourself is the way to go. There's no knowledge like your own authentic knowledge. And if you're not doing that, you're still not an adult. You're still letting some fictitious daddy in the sky tell you what to do. And if that worked, we'd be a healthy world populace. We wouldn't have wars, and we would be having more orgiastic behavior. And in my upcoming edition, I will explain to you and give you reference to authors and experts citing that we do come from a long history of orgiastic behavior, and I'll show you where that transition point came in history. Now, this book here, Pottinger's Cats, if you have not read it, it's quite a profound little book. Frances Marion Pottinger, MD, did, I think, 9 years of research, 9 or 10 years of research on about 800 or 900 cats, looking at what happened when he fed them cooked versus raw food. He was actually doing research on adrenal gland function and various other things. But one of the things he noticed in his research is that as cats progressively ate more cooked food, and I believe he gave them raw versus pasteurized milk, if I remember. It's been years since I read the study. But one of the things he highlighted was that the sexual behaviors of the cats began to degenerate in successive generations on cooked and pasteurized foods, to the point that there was no longer any normal distinction of sex. In other words, male cats would try to have sex with males, females would try to have sex with females, and simultaneously, while their sexual orientation was breaking down, so were their motor skills and the integration of their nervous system and their biological functions, to the point that by the 4th generation they became extinct. And then it took him 4 complete generations of feeding them properly to regenerate their health. And we're right now in the generation, if you look at how long we've been processing food and using things like pasteurized foods and overly cooked foods and overly processed foods, the children that are on this planet right now would be the equivalent of the 4th generation of cats. And I can tell you from studying this book and looking at my clinical observations and working with people that come to me very sick and unhealthy and eating standard American diets and standard Western diets, or basically any kind of processed food, that when I teach them how to eat and how to live properly, everything changes, from their body to their bones to their teeth to their eyes to their senses to even their orientation towards sexuality, creativity, and oftentimes they go from being living in the box to having the energy and the creativity to come completely out of the box. So my key point here is that how you're eating and how you're managing things like sleeping, breathing, moving, resting, all have a massive influence on your overall levels of stress. And as we get more stress, we tend to revert backwards to become more and more infantile and more needy, because our values get lower and lower as we move towards pure survival. So getting your health right can be one of the first steps towards getting your state of mental, emotional orientation towards sex, life, or anything else right, because just like a cat, you can go from being a normal cat to a cat that no longer has its normal sexual distinction, its motor skills, and its ability to relate or function in nature. And that means a breakdown of not only your understanding and ideas and perceptions about sex, but about everything in your life. Now, for those of you interested in more of my opinions and concepts on sex and some of the methods I use to coach people, if you go to chekinstitute.com or ppssuccess.com, there's an audio I created for you called 2 Kinds of Sex, Which Are You Having? And I talk about sex as grease, i.e. that which lubricates a healthy relationship and helps it grow and develop into something progressively more beautiful, or sex as glue, in which I talk about how sex can be a very, shall we say, challenging bonding force between people that aren't compatible with each other on a mental, emotional level, but are somehow nourishing something missing in them that they can't nourish on their own, which also goes back to the issues of not masturbating and not taking care of your own sexual needs. So our socio-cultural and socio-religious environment has produced a large population of people that are now addicted to sex partners because they're afraid to nourish those needs themselves for fear that it's going to be a sin or something like that, or dirty or whatever. So we have a lot of complicated issues. In my next edition, I will then take a look at sex beliefs and practices in different cultures, and I will look at the faiths of man and how consciousness grows and develops, and I will show you how the issue of pornography looks through the eyes of someone at each of the different now established stages of development of consciousness. and hopefully you'll find that interesting too. Enjoy your sex. Wear your bib if you're going to get dirty. I'll see you soon.